communities to collaborate and to find solutions to climate change. I'm Anna Yang, Acting Executive Director of Hoffman Center at Chatham House, and I will be your chair tonight of the discussion today. This webinar is part of the Reinventing series hosted by Hoffman Center. And this series looks at how to think about the world from a little bit differently when it comes to resource use. We have had already meetings on reinventing plastic bottle, reinventing meat, reinventing meetings, reinventing buildings, and reinventing fashion. And today is about reinventing air travel. A little bit about Hoffman Center. We were set up to look at innovative solutions for sustainable resource economy and carbon neutral societies. So in this discussion, we hope to look at how disruptions in the aviation sector could drive changes on how we travel in the future. Just please note that this event today is not held under Chatham House rule. So you can share ideas from the panel, and then also this event will be recorded. And if you have burning questions, use the Q&A chat box to include please make sure that you include your name and affiliation. You can also upvote questions. Also, you can tweet to us or about the event at the account at Hoffman Center by using the hashtag at Reinventing Air Travel. So just a little bit about the event tonight. Aviation is considered a harder to abate sector. There aren't very clear substitution or pathways. So pathways for decarbonization are vital. What COVID-19 as a pandemic has shown us is that it has disrupted business as usual. And you've seen all the numbers on the slide deck that was showing before, is that the industry is now in the process of reckoning what its future lies. And I think especially now that we have all the news about vaccine, as a world and a society, we try to imagine what would the future of air travel look like. I think there are two big numbers that I really want to sort of just highlight here in terms of how much, COVID, the pandemic has sort of affected the industry. And we have around almost 80% of global number of flights dropped. But a recent research also said something which have really, really stood out for me, which is, 1% of people actually cause half the aviation emission globally. So I think there's something quite interesting in terms of as a society, how do we, what is our relationship with travel and air travel, especially air travel in the future? There are some really interesting and innovations happening in the industry. So this is what we're going to hear tonight. So we have a really, really amazing and interesting group of speaker tonight. Just in terms of proceedings, we're going to divide it into two blocks. So we have 3 speakers in one block, have 10 minutes for Q&A. 2 speakers for the second block, have Q&A, and then we're going to open up everybody for so that we're all in the same discussion. So we have Robert Boyd, Assistant Director of Aviation Environment from the International Air Transport Association. We have Tim Johnson, Director of Aviation Environment Federation. Maria Fiskerud, Senior Project Manager from NEA Network. Dr. Jennifer Holmgren, CEO of Lancetech, and Jens Martin Skibsted to join us. So over to you, Robert.
Well, thank you very much, Anna, for that introduction, and good evening to everyone. I think your opening remarks there are very true, in that COVID-19 has really put the spotlight on many sectors and how we live our lives, but particularly aviation, because it's such a visible form of transport. We've been used to seeing airplanes in the air, and all of a sudden that changed very quickly. So the theme, I think, today is terrific to think about reinventing air travel. But I'm going to sort of open it up with some sort of framing this discussion a little bit, and that I'd sort of say we've been, to a degree, thinking about or actually doing it, reinventing air travel, sort of continuously over decades, I would say. And one thing I think the audience may have noticed is the price of travel has decreased in real terms, but also environmental performance has actually increased substantially over the years, perhaps something that not everybody is aware of. So a flight today, if we were taking a flight today, would emit about half the CO2 that same flight would have produced back in 1990. So we have had these, these incremental changes and improvements, which is good. Also, I would make the point that the aviation industry actually made environmental commitments, first global sector to do this, actually 11 years ago, back in 2009. So whilst this is certainly a very hot topic today, I guess inside the commercial airlines, it was a very important issue even a decade ago. The three commitments that were made back then was an incremental efficiency improvement year on year, and that was through to 2020. That's essentially expired now, and that's run at about 2.5% per annum in terms of CO2 efficiency improvement. Then there's been an agreement to globally cap emissions, and that's been done at the international level, and I think others may even talk a little bit about the detail of that, but that's particularly important. But the big one, which is the challenge we all think about, is how do we either eliminate the emissions, or the industry goal is to halve net CO2 by 2050 relative to the 2005 level. So that's actually a huge reduction in net CO2. And then it paves the way for net carbon zero around 2060, 2065, we think. I think the message from our side as the industry, and in terms of the work that we've been doing, especially in the past 6 months, and I think an influential report's just been released called Waypoint 2050, which really is the pathway as to how we achieve these emissions reduction goals, is the requirement to use or to transition away from traditional fossil jet fuel towards sustainable aviation fuel. What we know is it's technically feasible. There's no technical barriers, although we're developing more and more pathways to do this. But and we can also do it sustainably. We know how to measure sustainability, and we have an array of feedstock options. What we're missing is scale. And this is where we do need a call to action to really substantially increase the amount of available sustainable aviation fuel, and get the right policy mechanisms in place that mean that the supply side can sell it into a market, and that the demand side has the right policy there to be able to take, very large volumes. So what could reinventing air travel look like? Well, I think it's sort of frame it in this way. It's going to be a continuation of some of the things that are already happening. So that's new sorts of aircraft that you fly on. I'll give you an example. If you've flown on an old 767, let's say, or an old A340, relative to the new edition, like a 350 or a Dreamliner or a 787, that's about a 20% efficiency improvement just by changing all the technology that comes with those new aircraft. When you've been on an aeroplane of late, you've probably noticed that even things inside the aircraft start to look a little bit different, lighter materials, better ergonomic designs of seats. You don't always see pilots carrying in the 40 kilos of papers anymore. They might have a tablet. So all of these measures to make the aircraft lighter, the way we operate it. Winglets, you see that on the ends. That costs millions to put them on, but it can save millions of tons of CO2 over a year too. That's all great. But you will then increasingly see, and must see, a substantial increase in the amount of sustainable aviation fuel.
I have 1 minute, Robert.
Perfect. So, as I say, the analysis that the industry has done, and it has really been a collaborative industry effort, is to say that we can achieve huge replacement of our conventional jet fuel, almost up to that 100% level. There will be other really important technologies too, like hydrogen, like electric. They all have a big role. But I think just to draw that together, we're going to need, especially this decade, the governments to step up. We're seeing some great action already in the UK. It's good for jobs. It's good for economic output. It's also good for energy security, to really put significant effort into developing scale in SAF, and really, I guess, reinventing air travel, as we go forward over the next 30 years. So thanks, Anna. I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, Robert. Tim, over to you.
Yes, thanks, Anna, and good evening to everyone. So I really think that it's, like Robert said, it's a good opportunity to be talking about these issues. You look at the UK press this week, and Boris Johnson's announcement of a 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution. And you'll see in at number 6 was a transatlantic flight, zero carbon. And that's a goal. So you're going to hear, I think, in the course of this seminar, a lot about potential for getting there from alternative fuels right the way through to sort of prospects for electrification and for hydrogen and other things. So that all sounds very positive. It all sounds very exciting. But I think my sort of fundamental message is that those technology and sustainable aviation fuels will only succeed if governments actually put in place strong regulatory and policy frameworks to go with it. So to pick up on what Robert was saying about, there's a lot of conversation at the moment about encouraging the supply of sustainable aviation fuels, things that governments can do to help invest in plants, to give money for R&D. We certainly think that they should happen. That governments should be part of the leverage of those sort of technologies. But we want to ensure that once those things are capable of producing products and they come to market, that actually the right regulations are in place to make sure that industry sort of picks that up. Because it's going to be said probably several times during this call, most of the mitigation technologies available to aviation are very expensive. Alternatives, sustainable aviation fuels, for example, are currently at least twice that of kerosene. So where is the market incentive for airlines to come forward? The climate rationale is clear, but where is the market incentive? So I think it's probably these costs that have been a barrier to scaling up to date, mainly because we failed to create these sort of complementary policies. We have relatively weak drivers, and we have largely voluntary targets. IATA's targets are very welcome. The individual net zero commitments from airlines are very welcome, but they're not actually backed up by sort of mandatory binding targets, certainly not at a national level. And whilst there is a cap on global aviation emissions at 2020 levels, we still await to see whether any progress can be made on a long-term goal for this sector by 2050. And it's probably fair to say that we have relatively weak carbon pricing. Sort of recent changes to the UN's offsetting scheme means that very few airlines will have offsetting commitments in the coming years. And we probably have sort of regulatory drivers, standards that encourage new technology that sort of reflect what we're sort of doing at the moment, but aren't really pushing and stretching us into the direction that we need to go. And, one of the things that I find very surprising in this day and age is we don't have strong consumer targets either. So consumer drivers for change. We have an aware public, but they're not really supported with the information to make informed choices. And I think if there's one change that could happen in the next few years that could really accelerate the pace of change in terms of the uptake of new technology, it is the consumer pressure side. So we'd like to see more of that. So the two must go together, both policies on the supply side, but also on the demand side. We need to create that accountability going forward, and we need to create that market certainty too. When it comes to my sort of second point, I'd really like to sort of think more broadly than just technology and sort of sustainable aviation fuels. They do face many challenges. The potential is there. But we can't guarantee that they're necessarily going to deliver as much as we hope for at the time we hope for. So, as a result of that, aviation is still likely to be one of the largest emitting sectors in 2050. It's very unlikely that in-sector reductions alone are going to get the sector down to net zero. So we need other policy levers, and we need to not only have those binding targets I mentioned, but we need to sort of think about, should the industry be investing in carbon removal technologies, both to offset or balance its sort of residual emissions, but also to make sure that we actually have potential carbon captures that we can use in making synthetic fuels. And so gradually we move beyond biofuels towards a synthetic fuel in the future. But even then, I think we'll have to make sure that we have better carbon pricing. And I think it's very unlikely that we can avoid having a conversation about the amount of future airport capacity and indeed sort of the fact that people may well fly less. And I'll probably end on that point. Let's not assume that growth in the future will look like it did in the past. We were seeing signs before the pandemic that we have a much greater sort of climate conscience amongst the sort of global population. And people were beginning to think not just about what can industry do and what can governments do, but what can they do in terms of their own choices. And I think as a result of that, there were signs of behavioural change coming in even before the pandemic. And certainly all the surveys that have been conducted during the crisis suggest that some of these sort of behavioural changes will be locked in the future. And that's just not only for leisure travel, but will business travel return to pre-pandemic levels, for example? Or are we all used to having this sort of virtual office and these virtual opportunities to meet and talk? So I'll probably end there. I think there's probably a lot to sort of pick up on questions, and happy to go through them. Thanks, Anna.
Thank you, Tim. Maria, please.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be part of this panel and to be able to share what we are doing. I'm going to talk a little bit first about the Nordic Network for Electric Aviation. And I think, Tim, you talked about policies and those parts, but we do have a lot of that in the Nordics, as you know, and more coming. And we are trying to do it together and work together in the Nordic countries. Because when we go together, we are small countries one by one, but when we go together, we are the 12th economy in the world. So then it might give some difference what we are doing together. So this platform, the NIA, is where we gather Nordic stakeholders to accelerate the introduction of electric aviation in the Nordics. And we think that electric aviation is very suitable for the Nordic countries because we have very long countries, not maybe Denmark, but in the other countries are quite long. And usually we need to go through hubs when we fly. Even if you are flying between two cities in the north of Sweden, you have to go down to Stockholm and then fly back up again. But with electric aviation, that could be changed because then we can have economy even if it's short haul. So that's why it's so important. So we are not that much looking into in the Nordics the more vertical takeoffs, electric airplanes that maybe are more looked into in other parts of the world where you might have traffic jams or you need to go by traffic. We need to go have regional routes instead. So we are more looking into fixed wings airplanes, electric airplanes. And we already have our first. It's sometimes you hear that we don't have electric aviation, but we do. And the first electric airplane from Pipistrel from Slovenia was also certified. So now we have certified electric aviation, and we got the first one in September to Sweden. And it's located outside of Gothenburg. And that's the same place, Säve, where they are building the airplane behind me, which is a 16-seater. And it will be the first pilot will be built and in 2023, and we will be commercialized in 2026. So that's the kind of airplane that we will be using and will be most suitable in the Nordics. So why is this happening right now around electric aviation, and why do we see it take off? Well, I think it's multiple factors. It is what you have been talking about here before. It is a desire from us as travelers to be traveling more sustainable. And also it is a significant leap in battery technology. For example, the Beaver plane that was flying in Canada a year ago, they have about 180, 190 watts per hour in kilos. And 12 months later, today, we have batteries that have over 400 watts hours per kilo. But of course, these new batteries are also much more expensive. So now we also need to make batteries which are lower, that's more inexpensive. And we are
1
already,
minute, Maria.
okay, we are already starting to see many different shapes and forms of these airplanes, and Jens will show more of that later. But the more we work with it, we will probably see shapes and forms that will be more effective and also more good for business senses. And this is a new type of transport with less expensive operation, 75% less fuel cost, quieter, so you can move closer to cities and easier to maintain. So a 19-passenger electric airplane like this one is equal to a 76-seater when it comes to business costs. So this gives us new business opportunities. We can fly on demand, we can fly point to point, and more likely, it's more like public transportation. So we think this could benefit for business in rural areas. You can look at it as a bridge in the sky, for example, between Finland and Sweden and other parts. And we also think about the hippie 2.0, that more people from that today lives in the cities now can live outside of the cities and maybe commute into the cities instead. So maybe, who knows, this new behavior might lead to the end of urbanization.
Thank you, Maria. That's actually a good way of asking. So this is the end of the first block of conversation. I would like, let me check on the list of the Q&As for here from the audience. There's a specific question from Eric Bauer to Robert. I'm wondering if the aircraft of the future will have an increased amount of plastic. I'm assuming so, this will become from petrochemical industry, which starts with fossil fuel. Any ideas of new tech and fabrics to replace these plastics? Is this an issue for the aviation industry?
It's a good question. I'll try and keep an answer fairly brief. Yes, there is the ability to develop sustainable plastics, or coming from the sustainable chemical side, and there are some of the sustainability certification bodies that are already looking at certifications. Their plastics are as big a topic as sustainable aviation fuel. Single-use plastics is a problem. However, putting extra weight in the aircraft can actually have the same problem because you end up burning more emissions. So there's a trade-off, and airlines have been doing this calculation very carefully. I'm not the absolute expert here on the single-use plastic side. It's being regulated in many countries as well. There has been a big reduction in onboard plastic. In terms of materials, I have no doubt that's going to continue to advance. But my best view on this, or guess, is that it will advance sustainably. It's just critical to get these things right. So there'll be carbon fiber and all these sorts of technologies that can be done the right way.
Thank you. Talking about scaling, I think all of you were talking about scaling, and obviously you talk about the policy framework. Do you have views about what kind of investment models could scale up innovative aviation solutions?
We're at this stage in sustainable fuel development. Let's just look at this for a moment, where you're in this what you'd economically call the valley of death, where the technology works, we've got the feedstock, but we haven't got to a commercial model that's got a functioning market. I think Tim sort of mentioned a number of, let's say, twice the cost of conventional kerosene. The issue for airlines is if you get these competitive distortions where one airline maybe has a lower cost relative to another, it's not sustainable. So that's why the policy framework, and even morphing out to the global level, has to really take hold to eliminate these distortions, so that you then, I think you can put in place policies, could be supply side and demand side policies, that allow the sort of the confidence for investors to go and, as people will say, put steel in the ground and develop these plants.
Maria or Tim, did you guys have ideas about different kind of investment models for scaling?
Well, not necessarily about the investment models, but I think if you look at the sort of projections of sustainable aviation fuel use sort of going forward, And there are some sort of strong coalitions really pushing for this now, not just within the industry, but the work of the World Economic Forum and the Energy Transition Commissions both see big markets in the future. But actually, they do say that you need quite a strong carbon price to drive that. And I go back to the point that I made. I think the carbon price at the moment is relatively weak. If you sort of take the point that fuel costs, and Robert may correct me, but for sort of legacy carriers, and it's sort of 25% for sort of low costs, and maybe higher for 25% for legacies and higher for some of the low costs. But that's such a significant part of your operating costs that if these fuels are twice that, it's going to have quite a noticeable impact. So unless you get a particularly strong carbon price, and Adair Turner, who used to head up the UK's Committee on Climate Change and is now at the Energy Transition Commission, talks about having carbon prices in the region of sort of $200 per tonne initially to drive some of these technologies through, and obviously getting sort of cheaper as you get to scale and sort of diminishing in the future. But I just think it just shows how big the gap is at the moment.
Yeah. Maria, I thought you were muted. Did you want to make a comment there as well?
Yeah, I thought we have been working with co-finance tools like Green Fund that I worked with and was the CEO of before. And there we have one part is paying for the premium cost, and one part 75% for the premium cost, and then 25% for projects and trying to upscale. But as you know, we don't have the biorefinery in Sweden yet, so we haven't really been fully successful, but at least we are a little bit on the way. And we are also talking about green order books, where everyone can put in like an offtake agreement, but that a lot of them are doing the offtake agreement together, and then maybe we could sell the order book to a producer that would like to start to build a refinery. So we are looking into kind of different mechanisms to try to get it up or started.
That's very interesting. There's here a question. So there are two questions. I'm mindful that we have a little bit less than 5 minutes before we move into the second sort of block of. There was here about, just to Tim's point about carbon price, what about charging consumers for paying sort of carbon, some kind of carbon premium?
And indeed, some, and I'm sure some of the panelists in the second half will talk about this, because actually there is a funding model where some of the corporate travellers are electing voluntarily to pay more. So rather than sort of offsetting their emissions to sort of justify the carbon footprint from flying, they're prepared to pay the differential between what an airline would have to pay if it bought kerosene and what it would have to pay if it bought sustainable aviation fuels. So some of these sort of pricing mechanisms are happening voluntarily. But yes, I think this is a general comment. It's not confined to sustainable aviation fuels, but ultimately, it's very difficult to see how we can make a transition to net zero without an impact on the cost of air travel, whether because governments have imposed taxes or other sort of forms of levies, or whether the industry has had to assume those costs and therefore is passing on to the consumer. But I think it's inevitable, I think, that we will have some costs pass through to passengers.
Thank you, Tim. Go ahead, Maria.
That's exactly what we are doing in the Green Fund, and also all the airliners in the Nordics now have the opportunity for the traveler to pay if you're a business traveler or a private traveler. And also there is in the Nordic ministry there is now an investigation that there will be decided, I think maybe next year or the year after, that we will have a fund, a CO2 fund, where you have to pay for your CO2 emissions, and then the fund will be used for electric aviation or building a refinery, biorefinery, or for paying for that extra premium.
Thank you, Maria. Robert?
I mean, I fully agree with the other panelists, but just to paint the complexity here, if we did just sort of focus on a country or a couple of countries, yes, you might be able to impose, as a higher price on, more appropriate price on carbon, etc. But the problem is global, and even solving it for the UK doesn't really solve the global CO2 problem we have. All of the future growth in passengers is really, certainly in our forecast when we go up to 2036, is China, India, Indonesia. And these conversations, these discussions are terrific, but they're quite different if we're having it in other parts of the world. We have to bring the world along together on this, because this is a global problem. So we can be leaders, I think, certainly the European thinking is leading, but we have to spread this thinking to the rest of the world and bring them along with us and help design global policies.
Thank you, Robert. That's actually a really good reminder. I mean, I'm from Brazil, and there are places in the Amazon that either you fly or you take a 6-day boat or 18-day boat. So it puts things into perspective, right? In terms of also access to all sorts of important education and health and stuff. So thank you for the panelists for the stay there, because we will also in the end open up for everybody to sort of a broader conversation. So for the second block of panelists, we have now 3 speakers. We have Omar, please help me with your last name. Omar Bar.
You did perfectly on the first one.
Omar Bar Yohei.
Okay,
Omar Bar Yohei is the CEO and founder of Aviation. So you be the first speaker here.
Got it. So can you guys see my screen? I only have 5 minutes, so it's going to be a shooting range here. So Aviation Aircraft basically takes what we've been just talking about and has been building this for the last 5 years. It's the only thing we do. We build a 9-seater aircraft to serve communities and connect them. That's about it. Regional travel, the only thing we do. This is Alice. This is, by the way, besides the previous render you've seen for the fancy Vision mission, there are 0 renders on this presentation. These are all pictures. So this is the first iteration of the full-size airworthy Alice aircraft. This was presented at the Paris Air Show. We managed to fly 1, burn 1, and build 5 in general. Going through the process of building these aircraft is a challenge. I don't think anybody has a different opinion about it, but I think what we need to remember is that this is real and this is doable. The Alice does roughly 1,000 kilometers, so 540 nautical miles, and it does so at 240 knots. But yes, it only takes 9 passengers and not the fabulous 19 that the Swedes are working on, mostly for certification reasons. We think that if somebody manages to fly a prototype in 2023 and certify it in 2026, it will be a world record for any kind of aircraft. So including new technologies is actually quite difficult in such a time frame. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to build, and again, all pictures here, a new passenger experience that will actually make sense for a point-to-point all-electric flight. As was mentioned, electric makes it cheap, and that's why it works. So why is this good for an operator? Well, first of all, it decarbonizes regional travel. That's awesome. But if you really want this to work, well, I've recently moved my headquarters to the west coast of the United States because it's all about the money at the end. You need a big market and you need people to climb aboard, pay a ticket. I don't care if you charge them for the CO2 directly or if you build a government fund or a global fund. At the end, it's people who are paying for it. And they will need to pay for it. But this needs to make sense. We need to make economic sense. That's real sustainability. Don't burn anything. That's cool. That's environmental sustainability. But there's also economical sustainability. This needs to make economic sense over time. We think at this size factor it does. That's why we started the company. We're doing it with the best bunch of partners in the world. Some of them are Brits, so I figured I'll keep it on. GKN obviously is the big player that you guys know, but Rolls as well has some competition in this table, but never mind that. What do we call industrialization? When we build an aircraft, this is what it looks like. This specifically was taken in France because we have an assembly facility there, but it looks more or less the same in the US. And we did not go to France because French people move quickly. We went to France because we needed to get our planes done in the area where they will be presented or tested. So this is before the Paris Air Show, for example. To industrialize this, a company like ours will need to bring forth roughly $500 million. That's the cost of bringing a plane like this to market, give or take. You want to get it done, doesn't matter what kind of incentives you have, it needs to make business sense. You need venture capital coming in, you need clients at the other end saying, hey, I want to pay for this plane because my passengers want to go in this cabin and my pilots want to go in this cockpit. And that's what we're doing. The Alice will be market available here in the US in 2023. We're in a flight test campaign as we speak, despite COVID. I don't think COVID has a real influence on this. And I think that we will be seeing all electric passenger aircraft at these kind of limited ranges, regional targeted markets in the 2023-2025 timeframe. So that's us.
Thank you. I was just noticing, is that other aircraft called Nefertiti? Is that her name?
No, it's Alice.
Oh, that's Alice. Okay.
Yeah, it's Alice. Yeah, it has plenty of reasons, but that's another panel.
Okay. Jennifer, over to you.
Thank you, Anna, and really an honor to be part of this event. Let me share with you. I think we all agree that mitigating climate emissions and climate-causing gases from hard-to-abate sectors means we're going to have to find ways to decarbonize aviation. So what we do as a company is we use waste and convert that to ethanol, which can then be converted to jet fuel. So let me tell you a little bit about how we do that. We do gas fermentation. So we have an organism, a natural organism, that can eat carbon monoxide, hydrogen, and carbon dioxide. All of these gases are readily available in many industrial off-gases. And we take these, we ferment them like you would ferment sugar to make beer, and we make ethanol. Where else can you find these types of gases? You can take solids like agricultural waste, municipal solid waste, and gasify them and have the same type of feedstock. And you can even take CO2, whether it's directly air captured or out of a flue stack, and with using electrolysis to make hydrogen, you can couple the CO2 and the hydrogen, and again, use the same technology platform to make ethanol. We can make ethanol, convert the ethanol to jet fuel, and we also have a path to chemicals. This story, however, is not complete unless I add this. At the end of the day, we have to get ourselves into a circular economy so that if in fact we are making chemicals from waste, we then recycle them back and put them back into the carbon process. Our goal is really not to take any more carbon out of the ground and instead to use all of the above ground carbon to make all the things we need in our everyday lives. I know this sounds like science fiction, but with our partner Shougang in China, we have a steel mill gas emission that instead of going out the flue stack actually goes into our fermenter. We've actually made almost 20 million gallons of ethanol, and that means we've abated the equivalent of 90,000 tons of carbon dioxide. Of course, 90,000 tons is not a lot in terms of today's carbon emissions, but at least this is one application of the technology and we can apply it globally. As Rob mentioned earlier today, I want to just discuss what it takes to scale a process technology. To get to where we are today, LanzaTech is taken 15 years and $400 million. That is what it takes to scale a breakthrough process technology, because the larger the units get, the more expensive they get, and to the point where the commercial plants are on the order of $50 to $100 million. Because you're de-risking as you go along, until you cross the valley of death and build your first commercial, you haven't de-risked it enough to diffuse it. This is very much like solar, which took more than 30 years to get to the point where it was diffusing and you could see a solar plant everywhere you looked. Because of that, and because of our experience in scaling our ethanol technology, when we completed the development of our jet fuel technology, we decided to raise cash into that a little bit differently, because the cycle takes a long time, partially because what you do is you go to the next scale, then you prove it, then you go raise cash, and you keep doing this over and over again. So what we decided to do is to launch a company to scale our jet fuel technology. And instead of raising the cash simply to build the next scale, the Freedom Pines demo facility, what we did is we said to our investors, if that looks good, will you commit to building a commercial facility and put in an additional plug of capital? Are you willing to make that commitment now so that we don't have to go back out and raise cash every time we want to build a commercial? As you can see, Suncor and Mitsui agreed to do that. ANA is also one of our investors, and the Department of Energy in the United States through a public-private partnership is helping us get there. But just to get to this point took 10 years. And what I want to do is have 100 million gallons of jet fuel available by 2022. We are talking about the need to get to net zero. And sometimes when I look at the target, I think of this cartoon. The problem with scaling new technology is the amount of time it takes. If something is going to be ready to diffuse out and have an impact, a meaningful impact in 2030, it needs to be ready to commercialize now. If we want to impact 2050, the technology needs to be ready in 2030. So my view is, and to the governments, please adopt technology neutral positions and support all solutions. New ideas, nobody knows what their potential is. So we sit here talking about SAF, hydrogen or electric vehicles, airplanes. It doesn't matter. We need it all. Our problem is too big. The other thing we need to do is really start to embrace recycled carbon and power to X. The reality is the grid is getting greener, which means that we can start to use it to make fuels, get those green electrons into play. And the other thing is we have to help technologies either succeed or fail quickly. Otherwise, we'll be spending too much time and too much money getting there. I firmly believe that everything we use today can be made from recycled carbon emissions. I hope someday to show you that it's not just going to be the fuel, but also the seats, the fibers, the carpets, everything can be made from recycled carbon emissions. I encourage you to think about that. I encourage you to leave no carbon that's above ground behind. Thank you so much.
I love the leave no carbon left behind. Thank you for that. Jens, please share with us some of your cool ideas.
Let me just unmute here. Hi, yeah. I'm gonna share a screen with you, so I'll take you through a presentation here. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah. So now play. Sorry, I'm trying to get behind this thing. Sorry. Anyway. I'm sorry, I can't get this to play. Okay. Anyway, you can see what it says. So I'm just going to browse through it like this. Oh, here it goes.
There you are. Now you have managed to unmute yourself. So you need to, yeah, there you are.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah. So one of the reasons that we're having this conversation today is basically that we that innovation is needed, and that sounds kind of obvious, but it's not really obvious in many other fields. So the field that I'm most into is, I don't know what's going on. Sorry, it worked perfectly. Oh, here we go. Basically, we need innovation, and it's a very kind of innovation adverse industry. You know, probably because of regulation and the safety needed, etc. So I'm gonna, this is a car designed, I'm gonna compare that to the car world. So the car world and the urban mobility world, you can kind of implement all of these new technologies needed to go green right away. And that's not really the case for this industry, that's hence this discussion. Still, I think it's worth looking at the car, because the car is now being threatened by a ton of other modalities, And the car industry now agrees that it cannot be a standalone thing. It needs to adapt and integrate with these other modalities. And I'm claiming that this is true for this industry as well, for air travel. So the obvious solutions are these incremental or semi-incremental, that ones that we've been talking about. Green hydrogen could be one, electrofuels. This would kind of create a semi-status quo, so we can kind of reuse the infrastructure we have. Batteries, we've just heard, actually, this is the Alice plane, that are highly successful. We still need to, have a high potential. We still need to see a lot of work within energy density still, but these things could happen. But we just can't really predict what is going to happen, because we tend to think that these incremental things are the economically rational thing to do. Sometimes they're not. We also tend to think that new technologies are the ones to focus on, but I would claim that sometimes old technologies have to be revisited because they were discarded in a totally different context and could be recycled. So the first type of weird engines, machines thought of were ornithopters. They exist today. They were fantasy since the 9th century. They might seem complete weird, but they could be utilized to optimize some of the planes today. Having a bus is another type of typical modality, and we could have flying buses. So this is a plane that I was part of designing, and it's actually not. They claim to be the first flying car or certified flying car, but it's actually a flying truck, right? So if you can make a truck fly, you can make a bus fly. And the interesting part is that all of a sudden you can merge two now separate infrastructures. The car has served as the model for how we think of the future of planes in terms of manned drones. So obviously transporting the big number of people, it can be difficult at this point, or seem difficult at this point, but at least it's part of opening up for regulation. It could be a way to have politicians revisit some of these regulations. We would have to have many people die if we needed to implement these right away, for instance. And it opens up for a different vision of what air travel could be. Merging a helicopter and a plane, we've seen that rotorcraft are, highly inefficient. Still, other industries that are trying to be green are using rotors. This is the Flettner rotors. They have existed in planes very briefly in an experimental level, and there are tons of other experimental and historic modes of types of aircrafts. The gyrocopter is actually having a bit of a renaissance within these drones that we spoke about. Balloons, merging those with planes, is the oldest type of aircraft. And we tend to think of them now not being relevant anymore because of the Hindenburg. But you could easily build a safe hydrogen airship today, or you also have helium that performs as well. And you're seeing quite a few hybrid ones coming out. So this merger of a plane and an airship, in that they're heavier than air, so they can land. You have the Lockheed Martin version out there, and actually have some design bodies that have designed one, and you can already pre-order travels to the North Pole on them. So it is happening. Obviously, scale, all of these things is a question still. But I'm pretending that we don't have these issues that we've been talking about. You can merge a boat and a plane.
1 minute.
And these ground effect vehicles, I'm a strong believer in them. You probably know them as the old Soviet ekranoplanes or cranoplanes. And they are twice as efficient as their plane counterparts. And the technology is there. It's super easy. You can actually just phone and get one built. And there's one being built right now to ferry between Tallinn and Helsinki. So I think that is a very scalable thing. Trains, obviously, we see already now as the big competitor, at least on a regional level. A lot of my friends actually prefer to go on a plane just for because of personal conscience, you know, the personal morale, and but also part of this existing, you know, the pre-existing high-speed trains. You have newer attempts. So the most hype one is the Hyperloop. There's actually two buddies of mine that I work together with, Bjarke and Lars, that have designed this pod, the first manned trip in a Hyperloop a couple of weeks ago. The VAC train, though, is a very old invention. Jules Verne, I think, described them first. This is kind of a car-centric version of them. You could have more train-like VAC trains that could transport greater amounts of people. And at Many One, we designed this thing. It's a little bit like a white paper that like Elon Musk did with the Hyperloop. Just throw an idea out there and see if people pick it up. So this is heavier than air airship that sits, you know, in a kind of in a maglev mechanism in huge rings that makes it advance electromagnetically.
Jens, so, you need to close.
Yeah, okay, sorry. So just to say that there are tons of options out there that are totally unexplored, and some of them might just come out of the blue and be part of this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. So we have about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A for the speakers of the second block, which what you guys realize is now is about business innovation and in the future. About the future and future gazing. There is one here specifically on the electric side, which is, you know, one of the numbers that we shared based on a report that came out this week is 1% of people cause half of aviation emission globally. So will electric planes make flying even more socially exclusive?
Was that a question for me?
No, that was a question for Omer, I think.
No, I think that the whole idea is that this makes economic sense. To operate an Alice would cost around 25 to 30% of what it would cost to operate an equivalent turboprop. It's not 25% cheaper, it's 25% of the cost. So that actually, this is not a Maybach, this is a minivan. This is what people need to understand. That's the paradigm shift. If you were very rich in the early 20th century, you didn't have a horse and carriage, you had a car, and you had a driver with white gloves that would take you around. Today, if you're super rich, you have a pilot with black gloves and he'll take you around in your Gulfstream or in your Global. The idea of electric propulsion breaks that mold because of the price point. I could make this argument with zero consideration to decarbonization. I think it would be stupid, but the argument could be made.
There's another question on the electric plane. I think it kind of caused quite a lot of questions on the one here from an anonymous person. Electric flying is very energy efficiency as long as there's not an abundance of green energy. And so electrifying, how do you deal with this equation of, you know, so right now all the energies are not.
This goes very much in the direction of where did the energy come from? And that's a question that the auto industry gets a lot of times, and also, you know, the train industry. You made the trains electric, that's great, but there is a coal station that feeds the grid. So is it still smart? The answer to this has three phases, the way I see it. First and foremost, if you take 9 passengers on a plane and you replace probably 4.5 to 9 cars, then, well, that's more efficient. That's true for any kind of, just bring people together and get them to fly. The other side of it is the inherent efficiency of an electrical system is dramatically better than the inherent efficiency of a reciprocating or a gas burning engine. So that's another reason why do it this way. The third, and I think most important aspect, is that the way you charge your planes actually from a very small number, if you compare the grid of superchargers or high-speed chargers needed to cover a continent like Europe or the US, and give you as an electric vehicle user all the options you need, that would be tens of thousands of charging points. If you look at how many airports are all around Europe, that's 4,000. the numbers are really small, and you can make sure that those 4,000 actually get their power and maybe even have the grid storage. Because when we sell a charger, it's not a charger, it's a big truck full of a battery, and that's your grid storage, because we want to deliver energy at high rates. So in a way, you can make sure that you actually do use renewable sources. You charge the charger, if you will, when the sun is shining or when the wind is blowing, and where, you know, geo actually makes sense, and then you charge the plane when you need to. So it helps planning in a very, very substantial way, because aviation is a planned industry. When I climb into my Tesla, no one at Tesla knows how far am I going to go, how fast, am I going to stop, do I visit my auntie or do I go to work? When someone climbs into an Alice, for all practical purposes, an Alice engineer knows where he's going to go because he has a flight plan. So you can plan for it. And that's a very, very big difference.
Thank you. There's a question here about waste, but from a different angle, maybe Jennifer or any of the panelists as well. So what happens to hundreds of thousands retired aircraft? How do we bring that the circular, so not only the fuel, but also the aircraft? Jennifer, if you want to answer.
I'm an expert in that. I think Rob may be in a better position.
Go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm not the absolute expert, but there is aircraft decommissioning is another topic in itself. So the simple answer is about 90% of an aircraft can be recycled. And there are the major airframers have facilities to decommission the aircraft and recycle the majority of it. So doesn't happen in every single case, but it can happen, and it's important, as you say, with a lot of aircraft ultimately retiring.
I'm just trying to go through because there are quite a lot of questions, and I think I would like now just all the questions is like to all the panelists that we have another 15 minutes. I actually wanted to bring a little bit also on the consumer sort of behavior shift here, in terms of, you know, something that we were talking on the first session about the need for consumer change, and it is sort of, you know, I'm just thinking about like flying shaming, which is like people will at some point, when will that feeling that you feel embarrassed by flying? It's just like right now, as a Brazilian, I feel embarrassed because I like to eat meat. So I restrain the amount of red meat that I eat. It doesn't stop me wanting to eat it. So, you know, when will that sort of trend, how do you think that, whether it's coming, and then how will it shape the industry? Does anybody want to comment on that?
Yeah, I'm happy to come back in. I mean, I think there were signs in some countries that it was beginning to have an impact even before the pandemic, especially on sort of domestic and some sort of short haul routes where there were alternatives. If you look at the data trends, there was evidence of modal shift within some states. But you know, is it here to stay? Was it a reaction to the climate protests that we saw in 2019 around the world and an Extinction Rebellion, or is it something more fundamental that people will sort of retain and sort of want to keep coming back to as they move forward? And I think it probably is the latter. I think the signs support the latter. I mentioned briefly in my presentation that it's not just a question about how often you fly, but how you use aviation. And I just responded to one of the questions in the chat by saying, if you look at the difference in efficiency between carriers operating on the same routes, in some cases it's as much as 50% or more. Not always. Some of them are much narrower, but they're quite wide. So it's not always just a question of to fly or not to fly, but carrier A over carrier B offers like increased it offers much better performance. So, and I think that's the sort of change that I think is needed in terms of supporting choice, giving the information. People understand not only what sort of part flying represents in terms of their overall sort of lifestyle and their sort of other activities, but also, you know, how they use it. And I think, you know, why is that important? Because it's not about all the exciting stuff that we've been hearing about. That's the innovation, but we also want to put pressure on the other end of the fleet. You know, we want to get the less efficient equipment out. And I think consumer purchasing power is one way to drive that.
Oh, thank you. And just on your point about disruption as well, something that we sort of touched on sort of throughout this discussion is, now we're all working remotely, and there are different, also part of what we're doing at Hoffman Center at Chatham House is also to be sort of thinking about future of work. And we actually had, our last session was about reinventing meetings, right? So in a way, it's like going back to office, face-to-face meeting, which is also, business travel was a big part of what air travel was about. That will definitely disrupt the aviation industry. And the same thing as Maria was pointing about cities, right? Because of this whole discussion about redesigning, rethinking of work, what would city look like? Would you like to comment, Maria, Jens, on this in terms of disruption coming from other sectors?
I think I guess we started the flying shaming in Sweden and started to talk about it. If I go back to that, and I think we will. I think the difficult thing is right now. We know that we have the solutions. We know that we will have them in the future, but it is right now. But then, well, now we have the pandemic. Well, so yeah,
COVID.
Yeah. So we do not travel that much, but I think sometimes I think about the trains, and if we go back 100 years, or in the beginning of the 1920s, I think we went from coal to electric for our trains in Sweden. And now when we think about trains, we think about a very sustainable way of traveling, at least in Sweden. I know it's different in other countries, but I mean, I hope that we will give the aviation the same opportunity, because it's actually not aviation in itself. It is the energy, it is the fuel that are the problem, not aviation. And I think it's really important that we travel. We need to meet other cultures. We need to see each other, to talk to each other. Or I think we will have other things, the social part of sustainability, wars and things like that, that might happen instead if we don't meet and interact with each other. So I think that's really important. And that's also what I think what we see now during the pandemic, that we, if I could call it the dark powers, or that we can see that, and that we are more and more looking into our own part of the world, and we need to kind of save ourselves. But I think we need to look at it. We are global, we are humans, we are here together. We need to save the world together, and we all need it to do that. And then we need to travel as well.
Really good point, Maria. Thank you.
Can I comment as well?
Yes, please.
Okay, so so I totally agree on these constraints. I think one thing that's interesting to observe about the type of meeting we have now, or I mean, video conferencing as a competition to flying, is that although you have supersonic flights that are still being talked about, they're never going to be remotely as fast as this, right? And so I agree that we'll still have to meet, but we can still choose when we meet. And if speed no longer is a competitive edge for flying, you could start envisioning things that are much slower. So one of the things that are attractive with airships is that they are very slow. If you read passages from back then, when they would be transatlantic, you would hover like 100 meters or 200 meters over the ocean and see whales, because they were undisturbed and it was quiet, right? So there are other things you can gain. I on my honeymoon, I went on a train trip in the US just because I wanted to enjoy the trains. It was not a special train. It was just an ordinary American train, but because they're so outdated, I enjoyed it as a historic ride.
Wow, that is really interesting in terms of like when we'll sort of, yes. the speed. Sorry, my brain just went somewhere else completely. We have 10 minutes more before, and we have so many questions. I want to bring back again a little bit. There are a couple of questions around investment. One here just in front of me is, how is the aviation being affected by the financial market concerns, sort of as part of that, the task force, the TCFD, which is Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosure? Are investors asking the questions, or is the pressure coming from somewhere else? Jennifer and Omer.
Yeah, so
please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, we actually closed LanzaJet in June, and I would say that was in the middle of Aviation Armageddon, right? And you know, we were able to raise the cash, and I think a lot of the reason is because there is a real commitment that the future will be different and has to be different. And so what I'm finding, and everything I do is sustainable, it isn't just aviation, I'm finding more interest from the investment community because they are realizing that we have to change away from a linear and a fossil-based economy. And so I see more and more interest.
Thank you. Omer.
Yes, I would have to subscribe to the same ideas for very, very different reasons. I think the investment community understands COVID will go, and I think that we are at a very, very interesting cross-section of economic and, let's say, other catastrophes right now. And obviously, aviation is in the eye of that storm. What we need to remember is that while the aviation industry looks terrible right now, it has a few players and it is big. And while video conferencing is great, I seriously doubt, and investors seriously doubt, it will replace the 4 billion air tickets sold annually. And that means that this will have a renaissance in a big way. Now, if you put that aside for a second and remember that there is nowhere else to park your money. There is a lot of money out there. If it's in a bank or if it's in all sorts of government bonds, it's literally losing real value. Sometimes it's even losing nominal value. The commercial or let's say the investment environment was never more aggressively pushed, and we are seeing it I mean, think of what's happening in the stock markets in Europe and in Asia and in the US in the time of probably one of the worst pandemics with the worst influence on job and real economy, but still markets are somehow up. The only answer is that, well, guess what? Every other option is just terrible. So there is money out there. I think sometimes it's very, very smart money trying to be a player in that renaissance when it comes. Sometimes it's the exact opposite. It's just give me something that has growth potential in it. And my job right now is to spray and pray, as they like to say in this industry. So I think there is investment opportunity out there. I think that what we're seeing out of governments, be it because of very clever incentive initiatives trying to push for, you know, a Green New Deal or whatever, that's awesome. But I think we're also seeing roughly the same size of financial commitment just because there isn't anywhere else.
That's a good point, Robert. And can I just, sorry, before I need to sort of start closing. So you can comment on that and also make your final remark, and then I'll invite all the...
I'll be very brief. It was just, I agree with the sentiments from the two panelists then, but just an anecdote, something that we've tracked actually in terms of investor interest in this topic of sustainability directly for the airlines. And I go back to October 2018. That's when we saw a material change, and that was actually the time of the release of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, the really significant report that basically said we need significant action by 2030 to be on track for the 1.5 degrees mid-century. We saw an increase of about 7-fold in terms of analyst questions to airlines on the topic of sustainability from that point, and it remained elevated, and it has still remained elevated. So that's been the trigger. It hasn't just happened in COVID. It's now what, two years we've seen that, and I don't see that trend disappearing at all. I do agree though that travel will return. There is value in for many reasons in face-to-face. I think this technology is brilliant. It has its place, but we do need to solve the aviation CO2 challenge to allow the world to still have what is the freedom of movement, freedom of opportunity, experiencing cultures, respect for other. For each other, and the value that creates for our societies, as well as the economic value. So,
thank you. So I have here a really good closing question. This is from Bernice Lee, the founding director of Hoffman Center. So what is, and then I'll ask you to each one of you to make a comment. What is the next big thing, or the next breakthrough that we should be looking out for this space in the near term? When will we know when change is really afoot? Omer, you're muted. Go for it.
I think we are already touching. I mean, the people who are building things in this industry are already touching the first step, which is all electric. I think the next step is, I think this is going to happen. It's a matter of, is it 5 years and is it a big shift, or is it 10 years and is it a big shift just then? I think the interesting part would be the understanding that battery-powered all electrics will not fix the bigger problem. It's not enough. And as was said here by Jennifer, we need everything. It's a big problem. And I think that the next iteration is probably in the area of clean burning fuels, meaning probably hydrogen, but not only. There are a few alternatives out there. And I think this is more in the 10 to 15 time frame, 10 to 15 years, that is, to really be touching the components of the technology that makes a difference, and then products probably 10 to 15 years after that. So it's going to be a while until we see an all-electric A350 or 787, and the question is, okay, so by then it could be even supersonic, but it will be not exactly what you imagine as a kind of Tesla-like, hey, all battery, don't worry about it. It will be a bit different.
Jennifer, I saw that you're muted.
Yeah, so this is interesting because I think of the world transitioning to a distributed world, okay? So we need to start thinking out of the box that everything has to be going to cross the ocean. And if it's going to cross the ocean, it's got to be the same plane that's also going to go from Oslo to Svalbard. And I really think we need to rethink, just like solar is distributed and has enabled completely different things. I think in aviation, the same thing has to be true. If we try to put everything in the same box, like we have ever since the fossil industry came along, we're going to fail. And I believe that the future world, whether it be process technology, aviation, chemicals production, is distributed. And that is the mental and physical transition that we must make if we're going to bend the curve. That's my view.
Good point. Maria?
I think we have to start to look at sustainable mobility instead. And we need to have all the different transportations, depending on my needs. I need different types of transportation, and we need to get them to work together. And I also, if we look into aviation, I think we will see a mix of different solutions being fuels or power sources. And I think we need to do it together. So I'm really looking forward to the next coming 10, 15 years, because I think we have a lot of solutions in the pipeline.
Great. Shall I call on you, Robert, Tim, and then Jens?
Sure, fully agree. We need absolutely every single solution. There's going to be some we don't know about yet. We're going to need them as well. But the thread that will tie the whole thing together, and for me is the big thing, is an international agreement. I think it can happen sometime between 2025 and 2030, and that's what will decarbonise, a very hard to abate sector.
Thank you, Tim.
Yeah, so I'm also in the everything camp. I think the additional thing, of course, is let's take an economy-wide perspective. We can talk in aviation about a hydrogen economy, more electric. So's everyone else. We need to think about how all that plays out and where it's best deployed. But in some ways, I agree with Robert. It's about creating that accountability. I don't necessarily think that has to come internationally. I think international and domestic effort can complement each other. But I think if you do sort out the sort of the binding targets and the agreements, then I think with that comes the market certainty, and all the other drivers that we talked about that will unlock the potential for these things.
Thank you, Tim. Jens, of all the cool stuff that you have seen.
Sorry?
Of all the cool models that you have seen out there.
Well, there are many I believe in, but I think in terms of when we see the shift, it's not going to happen necessarily when we see the ground effect or ekranoplanes or airships fly. It's going to be when these distinctions that we talk about today are no longer really valid, when it doesn't really make sense to talk of a silo, called, flight or air travel, or, so it's basically this multimodality that Maria also mentioned. So, and also, I think also in terms of regulation, when you stop thinking about planes, cars, bikes, whatever, but when instead think about throughput of people, distances you can get people through at what cost, both in terms of environment and economic cost, obviously. When we see that greater picture, defractioned picture, I think that's when we know the change will have happened.
Well, it was an amazing conversation. My brain was just like buzzed with really, I started this thinking, what is, knowing some of the sort of, also being quite aware about this whole, that's happening already in terms of sustainable fuel, electric planes. But I think, I think the closing of this discussion actually made me more hopeful, and also about this collective action of a different kind of future that we want to live in. So thank you so much for your time, for spending this, sharing your ideas with us. And thank you for all the participants who have joined us. And have a good evening, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.